plastics.
I was at Costco once, and while perusing the shelves, I came across a bottle of vanilla extract that was about 50 times bigger than I expected it should have been. It was almost a joke how big this container was. As I'm sure you're probably aware, vanilla extract more typically comes in small vials of about 50 milliliters or so. And as a result of the fact that over 80% of the world's vanilla beans are grown in a single place, on the island of Madagascar, and that vanilla beans come from a type of difficult to grow orchid that, among other things, flowers only once per year and must be hand pollinated on that specific day, it's fairly expensive. And so the very concept of a gallon of vanilla extract is just absurd, and yet there it was in front of me. I plucked it off the shelf, and of course it made a lot more sense when I saw it was artificial vanilla extract. But it also prompted me to consider something that I had never really considered before. Of course, in practical terms, vanilla is functionally just a flavor that I'm sure the artificial version comes very close to approximating. But the flavor doesn't exist in a vacuum, and up until recently, that flavor was associated with, and constrained by, all of the other factors that make up what vanilla is, that it grows in a certain part of the world, that it's a certain size and shape, that various cultures have developed practices for growing and harvesting it. What was interesting to me was that the part that is useful to us could be completely detached from those other factors. Those constraints are what keep the flavor we call vanilla anchored to a certain spectrum of flavors. So what happens when you remove them? It might be easier to understand these constraints in the context of foods like coffee and wine, which have a traditionally broad spectrum of flavors. Everyone knows that coffee can taste different depending upon where it comes from. Things like fruitiness versus chocolatiness, sweetness, acidity, they vary from region to region and make coffee from, say, Ethiopia taste distinct from other regions like Costa Rica or Colombia. And all these flavor aspects are anchored by the conditions in which those coffees are produced, and the varieties of coffee that have evolved through both human cultivation and natural selection in those regions. And when you take a product that evolves in the real world and you move it into the artificial world, you detach it from these constraints, and therefore the flavor of the artificial version is completely free to float. In the present moment, there's nothing substantially concerning here, because the products that these artificial flavors are based on still exist, and are for the most part still preferred. But as we head into the era of climate crisis, we are increasingly bombarded with news of ecosystem collapse and species extinction, and headlines are starting to tell us that things that have been fixtures of our lives since time immemorial, like coffee and wine and vanilla beans, are threatening to disappear. The wine-growing regions of the world are moving farther north as the traditional ones become hotter and drier, and in the case of coffee, there's recently been a question as to whether it will even be able to survive much longer into our climate-altered future. And in the case that one of these things were to completely disappear, then the anchor that we have that determines the taste of these things, as well as their infinite other indescribable and complex properties, disappears, and those attributes begin to float. And when that happens, we no longer have the ability to say things like, this artificial vanilla isn't very good because it doesn't taste like vanilla should taste. Because in a world that has no actual vanilla, there is no way that vanilla should taste. The flavor of vanilla was never fixed or defined. It was an evolving spectrum of flavors anchored by natural and human ecologies. And as we get farther and farther away from a time in which it existed, our collective memory of what it was supposed to taste like will fade. And different people will remember it differently and disagree. And before long, these flavors will cease to be real things and instead become the types of flavors we see in products like Gatorade and 7-Eleven slushies. Meaningless names like Blue Blast, in the famous words of Michael Scott, which are pure marketing and have nothing to say about the actual flavor of the product. I don't think there's any risk of this becoming our predicament in the immediate future, but it's interesting to consider, especially given that this is a direction we seem to be moving closer to rather than farther away from, exactly what it does to us, to our habits and to our products and to our lifestyles, when more and more of what we know becomes detached from any sort of imperative. For example, what happens when we decide that the costs of continuing to produce animal-based meat are too great, and the world moves to embrace synthetic meat, whether lab-grown or engineered, which is something that's been pushed fairly hard over the last few years? Those products would no longer be bound by what meat and chicken and fish actually taste like, but by what flavors are most pleasing to the people consuming them. In that case, it feels like what we're driving towards is a world in which everything that we consume and interact with is optimized entirely around producing the ideal proportions of chemicals in our brains that result in feelings of satisfaction and pleasure. And indeed, it does seem like there's a certain cross-section of humanity that already does live this way and pursue these things. But I don't think it's the majority. I think that for the majority, there's something more to the things that they consume beyond just how they taste. I recently watched that movie After Yang, and in it there's a scene where Colin Farrell's character attempts to explain to Yang, who is an AI humanoid, what it is that he likes about tea. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something to the effect of that he likes drinking rare teas because of the idea that the flavor is a product of a process that's connected to the soil and the plants and the weather, the infinity of factors and the great lengths that people go to produce it. And then he pours a cup and takes a sip, and Yang asks him if he can indeed taste that story, and Colin Farrell's character says, I don't know. The implication here being that it's neither the raw sensory experience nor the story alone that gives us a feeling of satisfaction with respect to the things that we buy and interact with, but rather a combination of the two, the pairing of sensory delight with conceptual meaning, a story, that produces a third quality, one that I'm not sure has a defined name, but which forms the basis of a lot of what we pursue in life. So the question is, what story does a gallon of artificial vanilla extract have, apart from the one it mooches from the real thing? Other than the story of its production, there's not much else there. There's nothing that embeds it in the fabric of humanity. And without a story, it seems to me like if real vanilla were to disappear, the artificial stuff would be doomed to suffer the same fate. That's probably a good thing, in the face of a matrix-like alternative of meaningless stimuli. And yet for some reason, we often seem to be allergic to the notion that stories have value in and of themselves. Especially as it pertains to food, I often sense that there is a subtle implication in all of the stories that you read on product boxes and company websites and such, that the story is just an explanation of why the food will taste better or be healthier. When my daughter was born last year, my parents came to visit me from the States and they stayed for a while. And not having spent an extended amount of time in Canada before, they, like many Americans, were surprised to learn that much of the milk that's sold in Canada is sold in bag form. I told them when we were at the grocery store that I usually avoid the bagged milk because it's overprocessed and comes from industrial farms rather than individual, identifiable farmers with reputations and skin in the game, which is a philosophy I apply to most of my food shopping. My mom seemed to accept this comment at face value in the moment, but later in the week, I happened to open her fridge and pour myself a glass of milk from the glass bottle I found in the door, and after I took a sip and made that sound that you make when you drink something cold and refreshing, and said something like, "Oh man, that's good," I looked up from the glass and saw that my mom was giving me a funny look, and she informed me that she had bought the milk that I just drank in bag form and had poured it into the bottle from the bag. Her face in this moment made it clear that she thought that the fact that I enjoyed the milk that came from a bag meant that there was no point in spending more money on the milk that I usually buy and that I was somehow logically defeated and must therefore start to buy milk from a bag. And then when I mentioned that I never said milk from a bag couldn't taste good, I was accused of moving the goalposts. But it's true. The purpose of the story, buying milk from a farmer instead of a complex, is not to circle back and feed into yet another practical, quantifiable attribute of the product. The story is the value in and of itself, because it is what connects us and roots us to humanity. And specifically, it connects us to the version of humanity that is meaningful to us as individuals. These stories are important for the same reason that things like family and friendship are important. It's a shared story, not a quantifiable metric. And I think the degree to which things like taste and health benefits are relevant is more in the way that these things fit into that story, which we already relate to. What those things should be emerges from that story. And in fact, the story itself is so powerful that it can even make things which, at a biological level, are extremely unpleasant into things that are actually desirable. The existence of stinky tofu in the Asian world and fermented herring in the European one should be enough to prove that point. And what's interesting is the fact that the connection between the product and the story does not even need to be genuine for it to add value. If my mother had never told me what she did, then there would have been no difference in my enjoyment of that milk than if it had been genuine. I think it's only the human tendency to pursue truth and the impossibility for a delusion to remain unspotted by everyone forever that prevents delusion from being an actual viable path towards fulfillment. Again, Matrix. But assuming there are not going to be any major changes to human nature, at least in the near future, it seems that the pursuit of true human stories is what will continue to drive us. And if you're looking for proof of that, look no further than the shining example of the storyless void that is the world of AI art. First of all, let me make a bold claim. AI art doesn't exist, because art must have meaning, no exceptions. and there's an enormous chasm between something that is aesthetically pleasing and art. I believe that the only AI art that has ever or will ever have value is that which is inseparable from a meaningful story about how it was created, or who created it, and why it was created, and how it's relevant. Everything else is nothing. Truly nothing. A collection of pixels on a screen, arranged in a way that's equal to white noise. In fact, it may even be worse than nothing in that, in addition to being totally meaningless, it also actively sabotages what meaning there is around us by drawing into question the authenticity of it all. And what I find particularly amusing is that, though we all know this in our gut, as demonstrated by the fact that we are not willing to put our money where our mouth is and to actually imbue these AI-generated patterns masquerading as art with real value, the way that a lot of us have spoken about these things has been in total defiance of that reality. We talk about the future of art and how AI is going to allow us to create such beauty in the world without acknowledging what is just so painfully obvious, that without a story, what we're left with is meaningless, valueless aesthetics. And though many will try to argue that AI is just a tool that will help artists better fulfill their artistic visions, what those people don't realize is that the part that is art is always the gaps in between, the parts that the AI can't do, because that is the part where real effort is expended, and from which the story that makes us actually care about the art emerges. There's a famous uncredited anecdote, at least I think it's uncredited, which is something about someone looking at a piece of art and saying, "I could have done that," and the artist replying, "Yes, but you didn't." This says it all. Art is not about what you've created, it's about doing the actual work of creating it. And just like all other art forms where the barrier to doing drops to zero, the result is not an elevation of art, but a trivialization of it, with a net result that we all stop caring. We stop caring because the work that once had meaning was turned into non-work with no meaning. Here's another way to think about it. How much would you say the Mona Lisa is worth? Now imagine that someone broke into the Louvre and took it off the wall and cut a hole in it with a knife. Now how much is it worth? Has the value gone down because the aesthetic value of the painting has gone down? Or maybe has it even gone up, thanks to the expansion of the already large story behind it? Another area in which I think this idea of the missing story is relevant is with respect to our current obsession with space travel and the colonization of other planets and the universe at large. This is something that's pretty trendy in tech these days. In a recent interview, Jeff Bezos said that he imagines a human future which exists primarily on space stations, and where Earth mostly exists as a vacation destination for people to come down from the space stations and have a relaxing time touring about our homeland. Outside of altering the primordial functioning of our brains, I don't believe that such a civilization is possible if the hope is that we can also be happy and fulfilled as part of it, because that type of civilization could not exist without relying on mass production of essential goods and services at an absolutely enormous scale. And it is in the nature of mass-produced products to be fundamentally disconnected from any kind of story that could give them meaning. A space station-based existence would have to eliminate all the complexity of our varied ways of doing things across cultures, eating things, making things, celebrating things, and reduce it all to something entirely practical, which has at its root nothing other than one person's or one company's recipe for survival in space. These stations spanning the universe would look a lot like the network of highway rest stops spanning North America, which have nothing to do with the culture that may or may not be present in the vicinity of each particular rest stop, and everything to do with what is the most efficient and cost-effective way to deliver the bare necessities that make long-distance road travel convenient, resulting in entirely meaningless experiences. Imagine the spectacle of a human race, thousands of times larger than it is today, living in a federated network of highway rest stops scattered across the universe. And if it so happened that some of the users of these space stations found themselves dissatisfied with the sterility of it all, their solutions would probably end up looking a lot like the tactics used to spruce up chain hotels and airport terminals: kitschy, or at best out of context, decoration, plucking objects of meaning out of the context that produced them and recycling them as empty decoration. It would all be hilarious if it wasn't the future that seems to have captured the imaginations of so many. There are two ideas here that I think are fairly central to my personal philosophy. The first is that for those of us who live an even remotely examined life, tickling our pleasure sensors is not enough, and may not even be part of what leads to a satisfactory life. There must be a story that guides the way we interact with the world, and that story can bring us satisfaction through both simple pleasures and complex ones, and can sometimes even make sensorially unpleasant experiences desirable. And the second thing is that the types of stories that we find compelling are almost always those that involve complexity. And though we are surrounded by complexity and are intuitively familiar with it, it also seems that, academically, it remains foreign to us, and that we lack the right words to describe it. And because of that, I think it's easy for us not to notice the fact that it is rapidly disappearing from our world. But I'll leave that for another episode. Once again, thanks for listening.
Think about it.